Liebe Nebula Mysticum-Hörer, Dr. Stern ist ein führender Planetenwissenschaftler, ein Pionier der Weltraumforschung und ein Mann, der sowohl die Grenzen unseres Sonnensystems als auch die extremsten Tiefen unserer Ozeane erkundet hat. Als Leiter der historischen New Horizons Mission, die Pluto erstmals aus nächster Nähe betrachtete, hat er die Art und Weise, wie wir das entfernte Ende unseres Sonnensystems verstehen, revolutioniert. Aber nicht nur das, Dr. Stern ist auch ein leidenschaftlicher Forscher in der Welt der Tiefsee. 2022 nahm er an einer Expedition teil, um das legendäre Wrack der Titanic zu erkunden. Ein Abenteuer, das ihn in die tiefsten Tiefen unseres Planeten führte. Im heutigen Gespräch tauchen wir tief ein. Nicht nur in die wissenschaftlichen Entdeckungen und Missionen, die Dr. Stern geprägt haben, sondern auch in die Fragen, die uns als Menschheit betreffen. Wir sprechen über das faszinierende Thema des möglichen außerirdischen Lebens, was es bedeutet, in den Ozeanen auf der Erde nach Leben zu suchen und wie diese extremen Umgebungen, sei es in den Weiten des Weltraums oder in den Tiefen der Ozeane, unser Verständnis von Leben und Existenz erweitern. Wir werfen einen Blick auf Pluto, dessen Geheimnisse durch New Horizons ans Licht gebracht wurden, und ergründen, wie der Weltraum uns nicht nur zu den Sternen führt, sondern uns auch dazu anregt, über die großen philosophischen Fragen der Menschheit nachzudenken. Was bedeutet es, an der Spitze des Wissens zu stehen und gleichzeitig die tiefsten Geheimnisse des Universums zu ergründen? Wir werden auch darüber nachdenken, wie die Erforschung des Unbekannten uns als Gesellschaft verändert. Seid gespannt auf ein Gespräch, das den Raum für sowohl wissenschaftliche Entdeckungen als auch tiefgründige philosophische Überlegungen öffnet. I just learned today that you went down the ocean to visit the Titanic in 22. Is that right?
Yeah, in July of 2022. Yeah.
Yeah, what kind of feeling was that? Do you think about what happened when you're down there and become nostalgic, or does scientific interest prevail?
Um, it was a fascinating trip. By that, I mean the entire 8 days from the time we left Canada to sail across the North Atlantic and then to do the dive and come back. Uh, uh, it became more poignant after the disaster the following summer when the vehicle that I was on was destroyed and everyone aboard lost their lives. We were actually the last mission to the Titanic before that accident. And I had been invited early that year to do it. It had not been a life ambition or something I really wanted to do, but it was an amazing opportunity to learn about deep ocean technology and deep ocean science, to be mission scientist on the voyage and to learn more about Titanic, to see it in person. And it was very sad because it's it's a gravesite. 1,100, I think 1,100 people lost their lives. And mostly poor people, because it was a very classist society in that time, and they were generally prevented from getting to the lifeboats, including the children.
Yeah.
And it's very deep, almost 4 kilometers, 3.8 kilometers to be exact, and it's extremely dark, pitch dark. It really is like a tomb, where things are preserved by the cold. And there's no light, nothing, everything is in eternal darkness unless you bring a light. It was emotionally moving, and it was intellectually fascinating, and it was personally rewarding all at the same time.
Awesome. Yeah. I know a Titanic historian, and his biggest wish was to visit the Titanic wreck also, but then tragedy struck, and it's sad. Sad what happened.
Well, I think this technology is available, and there'll be another way to do that in the future, not too distant, maybe in a few years.
I was thinking about imagine NASA builds a submersible to send into Europa's icy ocean. If you could design its mission objectives based on your Titanic expedition, what unique insights would you bring from the deep sea world to searching for alien life?
Well, I'm no expert in oceanography or ocean biology, and I'm not even an expert in astrobiology, although I've done a little work in that area. Um, I think that would be very exciting if we could put a submersible into Europa's ocean. And I think back to what Carl Sagan often said, which is no matter how carefully we try to think out how to test for life on Mars from a chemical standpoint, that we should expect to be surprised, and therefore we should keep our eyes wide open. He said, none of our chemistry experiments that Viking brought to Mars in his time in the 1970s would have detected a silicon giraffe, even though it's a large living being. They were built to look for very specific things. So he was a big advocate of just have the cameras take a look, see what we see. Do we see something that we think might be biological, independent of the chemistry? And I think that's the lesson for all the ocean worlds as we explore them, is to try to be as naive as possible and bring along very generalized detectors to see what we find.
Yeah,
I hope I live to see that.
great answer. I wonder what you've been to space, and that's awesome. I'm very jealous. And I wonder what kind of feeling is it to commute between outer space, deep sea, and Earth? Is there an environment that feels most at home for you personally?
Well, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say I'm most at home on the Earth, but I wanted to travel to space for many decades in my life, and I finally got a chance to do it, and I'm going back next year, and hopefully many times thereafter. And I found it just amazingly pleasurable experience, very fulfilling, very exciting, and then very special, more special than I even anticipated it would be. And I felt very at home there. So I look forward to more missions and longer missions, and a long string of them.
I remember when I was a child, standing at my window at night watching the night sky, and I remember I was angry because I couldn't get an answer to the questions. Where does it all come from? When I see all these stars and all these things up there, and I also ask myself, is there anybody else? And still, these are the questions that keep me awake sometimes. Do these questions still have high priority for yourself?
Well, I think all of us who are reflective and thoughtful, and particularly scientists, are always interested in the origin stories, uh, and coming to understand our place in the universe. It's amazing to me that in all of the billions of years that the Earth has been here, and even the billions of years that there's been life, that apparently only we humans ask these questions, that all of the other literally millions of life forms, species that have ever existed, did not wonder the way that we do. Where did it all come from? Uh, and it's also interesting that we seek out others in the universe who might be similarly sentient and inquisitive about these things. Um, Something very special, I hope not unique in us. It causes us to ask these questions. And I'm a little bit of a believer that we have a destiny to find others who are trying to make sense of the universe, not just to exist there the way that my pet dog or a fish or any given animal might.
since we talked about deep sea, I love the idea that there's a an awesome connection between space and Earth and the oceans. I've just talked to a mate on work today, and we I tried to explain to him the panspermia theory, and I like the idea. Something
Mhm.
came from up there and brought life to Earth. I think that's a great concept.
Well, I think we know that the Earth was built from material um, in space, and that it's firmly established that many of the raw materials necessary for life, the elements and some complex compounds, fell to Earth during the early era of planetary evolution after formation, and that even today, that complex organics rain down on the Earth from space. By these, I mean abiological organic molecules, but still precursors to life that are a big jump ahead from uh, uh, starting from scratch. And it's not, no one really knows if panspermia itself took place, but at least pre-panspermia is a proven thing. And across the universe, it's probably quite likely that panspermia operates. Whether it operated in our individual situation or not is still an open scientific question.
Yeah, interesting. Looking back, was there a, let's call it, first contact moment in your career, an experience or a discovery that fundamentally changed your perspective on the universe itself?
Well, I, I'm hard pressed to think of a specific moment that was that uh, sharply defined. Uh, but I have often thought that there have been really big revolutions in our understanding and therefore my own understanding of the universe just in the time that I've been able to be, productive in as a researcher in the field. You know, when when I was a boy, or even before I was alive, astronomers of the day, mid 20th century astronomers, looked out across the solar system with telescopes and didn't see any oceans. Not Venus, not Mars, not Mercury, not the moon, not on the satellites of the giant planets, and concluded incorrectly that there were no oceans. They concluded that the Earth was a weirdo, but it was only decades later in the 90s that we started to discover that ocean worlds exist. They're just different from Earth. That all the other ocean worlds in our solar system cloak their oceans beneath the surface, beneath kilometers of ice and rock. And if Earth is the weirdo, it's a weirdo not in having an ocean, but in being the only ocean world that we know of that wears its oceans on the outside, on the exterior of the world. That's a big revolution that um, has washed over my entire field. We now know that there are many ocean worlds and therefore potentially many abodes of life across the solar system and probably across the universe that we never expected before. There are other revolutions that have also taken place um, in the field of planetary science in the late 20th century and early 21st century, like the discovery of the Kuiper Belt. It redrew our map of the solar system and also showed us that small planets like Pluto are more populous than either the giant planets or the terrestrial planets. So I can't point to a moment in time when I had a scientific epiphany that really was paradigm shifting through the accumulation of knowledge, either as a participant in the field or as a participant in the research. Um, I am really now looking back and appreciating how much change has taken place in the past few decades, how different planetary science is and our understanding of our solar system and its potential for astrobiology relative to what we thought in the 1970s and 80s, before I began and when I was getting started.
How did you become so fascinated with Pluto in the first place?
Well, long before I was fascinated with Pluto, I was fascinated with planetary science in general. And even before that, I was fascinated by space exploration as a boy. But as I began to become a professional research planetary scientist, I found myself attracted to the study of Pluto, largely because there was very little known about it. It was the most wide open, the most mysterious, the easiest to make progress. At the same time, it was the hardest because we knew very little. So anything you contributed that was significant was a major advance. Whereas we knew much more, for example, about Mars and Jupiter and Venus and Mercury. But it was also the hardest because, unlike all the other planets of the solar system that we then knew of, Pluto was the only one that we didn't plan to send a spacecraft to. And spacecraft are the secret sauce. They're the superpower um, of planetary science because we really have learned that you can't get it right unless you go there, simply because you need to be very close to have the kind of resolution on the geology and to be able to determine the constituents of the atmosphere and search for magnetic fields and other things that we can't do from the Earth with any existing technology. Uh, and planetary science was completely revolutionized by spaceflight. It's only the reason that planetary science was a backwater of astronomy for a century is because it was stymied by not having spaceflight until to the 1950s and really the 1960s and 70s when primitive spaceflight began. And then it unlocked the whole field, and we began to appreciate the real solar system rather than just points of light. And we're now deep into that era, but still early days. We have to travel very slowly. It takes months and years. And Pluto just unfortunately wasn't a part of that first era of planetary exploration. It was left behind by the decision to target Voyager 2 to study Neptune and Triton and not to go on to Pluto. Actually, I would have made the same decision. I'm not saying they made a bad decision. But when I came along, Pluto had been orphaned in terms of its exploration. And it was purely an astronomical world. It's to be studied by telescopes or by computer modeling. And I just found that fascinating and irresistible. And I thought it was a bigger canvas for creativity and advances than if I started to work on something, say, in lunar science or Mars, where the basics were understood and it was more about nailing down details. That's not to indict anyone who works on those things. It's just that the allure for me was in the challenge of studying something so far away and try to make advances despite this gulf of distance and the lack of resolution that we had. So it was attractive to me. Meanwhile, I did work on Mars missions and comet missions and lunar science and a number of other things. But Pluto continued to fascinate me because of its challenges.
Awesome. Very long ago, I was reading a pretty old science fiction novel, and it was about Pluto and life on Pluto. It was a science fiction novel, of course. And then I learned, oh, there's something else. It's not always Venus or Mars or Moon. There's also Pluto. And then I learned about Pluto, and I found it very interesting. Yeah, also very interesting.
It's counterintuitive, and we didn't expect it. But now we have very good evidence that Pluto likely has a liquid water ocean like Europa. beneath its surface. There are at least four independent lines of evidence that all point at the same answer. Um, and if Pluto does have that interior ocean, it's entirely possible that there has been a development of biology there. We don't have direct evidence for it, but it's now become a possibility. And I think the next mission to Pluto, which is likely to be an orbiter, um, will explore the depth of that ocean and its properties in anticipation of landings and even submersibles like we talked about at Pluto. I've done a fair amount of thinking and published some work on the interesting aspects of these interior ocean worlds that make them more stable environments for the development of life than Earth-like environments with all the hazards of living on the surface of a world, where supernovae and stellar flares and giant impacts and other things are deleterious to life. Whereas deep beneath a roof of ice and rock, you're very well insulated from those things. In fact, you're even insulated from whether or not your host planet is near its star or not. And in fact, the whole concept of a habitable zone has now been really transformed because these ocean worlds like Pluto that are so far from the sun um, are a whole type of habitable environment that we never thought about decades ago. But we now know they're pretty common.
Well, since we mentioned Mars, what do you think? And we have Elon Musk wanting to go to Mars and bring people up to
He's
Mars.
not alone.
He's not alone, I know, yeah, but I have um, all the political aspects aside when it comes to Elon Musk. I pretty much admire his work when it comes to all that stuff. I really hope he gets people on Mars. What do you think a normal day on Mars will look like in, let's say, 100 years?
Well, I would say no one knows, but I would be very disappointed if it didn't look like a Martian version of what's going on every day in Antarctica today as a research environment. I would put that as the minimum. Um, and it may be that in 100 years' time that uh, that it's more than just a research base or a collection of research bases. That there may be actual um, uh, maybe an economy there. There may be um, towns and cities. There may be even a choice to terraform the planet. If not in 100 years, certainly I expect in 2 or 300 years. Um, and I can only hope that the advance of medical technology makes it possible to be alive in 100 years and see how this turns out.
Hmm. Maybe it happens earlier, but I don't think so.
I think it's going to be hard. I think uh, getting people to Mars is going to be hard. It's likely uh, to take more than one try. It's much harder than going to the moon. People may lose their lives just as people lost their lives in exploring the Earth
Yeah.
when the continents were very far away because the technology was so primitive, the technology of sailing ships. Um, and then once we're there, it will be hard to sustain a base. Hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Hard doesn't mean that it won't prosper. It just be objectively hard, just like Antarctica is tough. I've been there. I've been to the South Pole. I worked there. Uh, uh, in my view, hard is just part of the deal. If it's hard, then you just overcome it. But it will be hard, and that will make it difficult to go very fast at first. I do think we could put humans on Mars in a small number of years if we really try and we focus correctly. But to have sustainable human uh, presence will take longer than it will take a lot longer. It'll be a lot harder just because of the logistics than it will be just to simply do Apollo 11 to Mars, if you know what I mean by that.
Yeah. I, I personally get very excited when I think of yeah, getting people on Mars because I once talked to Avi Loeb and he told me if we want to look for interstellar artifacts, we should look on Mars, on the surface of Mars and Moon, because everything that went down there must still be there. I think that's very interesting. Maybe we find
Well,
something.
that's a very interesting point of view. Abby's really brilliant. And I have to say, I agree with him on this.
Many scientists, not only scientists, speculate about extraterrestrial life. If we receive a clear message from an alien civilization, let's say tomorrow, what would be your first thought?
I guess my first thought would be, can we verify that it's not falsified, that it's not really a terrestrial spoof, for example? But if we can prove that it's real, I think my second thought would be, isn't that wonderful? And didn't we know all along this day would someday come?
I always ask myself if we get a signal from another civilization, if we should somehow answer or not. That's a big question for me. But
It is a big question. It may be that we can't help but answer in the sense that if it's from somewhere close, then our radio frequency, television, and other electromagnetic leakage has been going out now for nearly a century. So there are a large number of stars that are already in that bubble where we've made ourselves known. Um, uh, I think when we get that first signal and know that it's real, the thing that comes to my mind is the title of an Arthur C. Clarke um, story that he published, I think, in the 1950s. The phrase that comes to mind is the title of that story called Childhood's End. I think it'll really be an epic transformation in the way we perceive the universe and our place in it. I think it will be very difficult for some people to believe it. There'll be a lot of deniers. And it's hard to know what the sociological reaction will be across the globe. But nonetheless, I think it really will be a pivotal moment in our understanding of the universe and in how we view ourselves.
yeah,
I'm excited. I hope that that comes to pass soon. But of course, there's no predicting when it will be. It may be a very long time.
true.
Or we may find life in those ocean worlds before we find evidence of civilizations far away. Um, it, it, I think it's a more certain pathway, in my view, is that we will find at least simple life forms in at least some, or maybe one, of the ocean worlds of our solar system. Whereas finding communications across interstellar distances, it's harder to predict when that will be successful. We may not have the right technology for it. It may not be right radio, maybe something else.
Yeah, and it would already be very exciting to find microbial life in some kind of ocean up there. That would also be very exciting already. Yeah, I would be satisfied then. Um, Imagine you could conduct an experiment in space with, let's say, no technical or financial limits. What would you do?
Don't you think that's a little unrealistic? If there are no limits, then we could do everything.
Yeah, let's think in science fiction terms. No limits. What would you do? What would be the first thing you would do?
That's tough. That's a tough question because
I guess
no
so.
limits, my first thought would be we would uh, go explore the solar system at a very rapid pace with humans and robots. But if there are no limits, why wouldn't we just go explore the galaxy?
Hmm.
What I hope is that, I think there will always be limits, practically, many kinds of limits, physics limits, engineering limits, fiscal limits, uh, others as well. But I do think that humans are going to uh, explore like that and become a multi-planet species, and that it's going to be for the good of humankind that we open up new possibilities. One of the greatest unanticipated benefits of exploration is the practical invention and what became the near ubiquity of democracy
Hmm.
that came about from the exploration of the Americas. And no one who was involved in funding it or conducting the early exploration saw that future. They thought there would be material good and prestige and even reason for settlement, and that there would be things we could import from the Americas that would benefit Europe. I don't think they foresaw democracy, and yet that changed the world more than anything, in my view, more than anything that they brought back, like tobacco
Yeah,
or new spices.
yeah,
I think they also did not foresee a day when the Americas, this faraway beachhead that was for exploration, would come to dominate the world in terms of its economic power. Just as we don't today imagine that there could be places in the solar system that may someday be dominating the economy of the distant future.
yeah. If you could borrow the curiosity of famous scientists from the past, whose brain would you borrow? Or what questions would you want to answer?
You ask hard questions.
That's my inner child. I'm just
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah. I don't think I could pick one. I haven't thought about it deeply enough, but there are many futurists and thinkers uh, like Arthur C. Clarke and Carl Sagan, uh, and for that matter, people like uh, Isaac Einstein, who I would want to have a conversation with and have a chance to explore ideas with that we can't today. Also, people like Edison, who were inventors, not just
Yeah,
scientists, people who were transformative uh, in their vision and their thought, either from ancient times or more recently, even like a Benjamin Franklin. Uh, uh, I suppose if we had the capability to speak to anyone, we would have the capability to speak to many. So I don't have to pick one. That's my dodge.
I often wonder if I could spend a day with a historical scientist. Who would it be? Who would it be?
Who would it be?
Galileo, Newton, Carl Sagan, of course. Yeah, but maybe Galileo would be cool. I don't know. What's one scientific concept or theory that seems, let's say, outlandish at first, but you secretly think has a shot at being true someday?
Well, I'm not sure if you would call it scientific or otherwise, but I think interstellar travel comes to mind.
Yeah,
We're very far from being able to do it. even in a primitive way. Um, we're very far from being able to do practical interplanetary travel. It's really at the limit of our technology. Um, but there will come a day when it's easy. Um, and I'm reminded that Carl Sagan wrote in one of his earliest books that if you asked Christopher Columbus the question, if you posed to Christopher Columbus that one day in the distant future from his time, tens of thousands of people would cross the oceans every day, he would not imagine airplanes. He would imagine large numbers, crazy large numbers of wooden ships. And if you asked um, native uh, indigenous species in the Pacific Islands about how humans might one day communicate across the entire planet, they wouldn't picture radio or television or optical cables. They would picture really big drums. And in the same way, I don't think we have a prayer of imagining the technology that will settle the solar system and eventually come to explore the galaxy. It's just too far in our future.
Mhm.
And even in just the short period that I've been alive, we went from spaceflight requiring superpower nation states to simply put something in orbit to where small companies can do that today after just a few decades.
Yeah.
And even put people in space. And I think it's very hard to project another 50 years in the future or 70 years in the future um, to where our time now is that distant as, say, the 1950s and 60s are to us today, much less centuries in the future. But because I'm an optimist, I think that humans are going to do amazing things and that we're becoming better and better at becoming our better selves, and that we will become a multiplanetary species, and it will be greatly beneficial um, uh, to the species and the society as a whole when we've done that.
That would be great last words, but I have two more questions before we wrap it up, since we still
Okay,
have a few minutes.
I'll, I'll
Um,
try.
what do you think is the most poetic aspect of the universe that few people talk about?
Well, you ask hard questions, as I said before,
I'm,
and
s-
thank you for them. But with almost no time for preparation,
I'm sorry.
the only thing that comes to mind immediately is that we exist as sentient beings, that we can appreciate that there is a universe and all of its possibilities, or at least some of its possibilities. I think that's very few people speak about that. And so that in our busy lives, I don't think people appreciate it. It is stunning to think that that the raw materials of biology would not just create biology, but create sentient beings like ourselves that can be self-aware and that even have a driving desire to find others like ourselves and to create sentience, at least in the form of AI. Um, it's a form of flattery, I suppose, for our own species that we look for others or we want to create an, others that can be more like us than like a rock, or more like us even than just like a really smart pet. I think that's a vastly underappreciated and completely magical aspect of the universe.
Great answer. Thank you for that. Last question. What do you think is the most underrated trait an explorer needs when venturing into extreme environments, whether it's space, deep oceans, something like that?
What's the most underrated trait? Thinking of all the important traits that explorers need, like strength and resilience and persistence, ingenuity. Perhaps and again, I'm reacting very quickly, but perhaps, perhaps the one of the most underrated um, is sales ability. One of the most important things that I've learned is that people who are inventors and explorers um, have to be able to sell their idea, uh, to find the resources, the funding to make it happen. In most cases, some people are just lucky enough to just start with those resources, but that's rare. And whether it's Columbus, uh, appealing to the king and queen of Spain, uh, or visionaries who appeal to create, let's say, the Apollo program, whether it was Hillary appealing to go explore Everest, or Shackleton, uh, down near the South Pole, and or hundreds and thousands of others. One thing that I think is underappreciated is the fact that they have to be able to sell their idea to make it a reality. And if they don't have the skills, they need to find partners who do have the skills to sell it so that they can do that exploration.
Yeah.
My father was a salesman. And I remember late in his life, he asked me what I did for a living every day. Of course, he knew I was a scientist and a researcher and an explorer and involved only in space. But when I thought about it and answered him more fully after a day or two, I said, Dad, I think in a way I'm in your business. I'm in sales because all of us scientists have to learn to write proposals and to be able to make an argument for why a given mission or experiment, or project should be carried out. And if you can't make that sale, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. So that's my answer.
That's a great answer.
Well, thank you.
Dr. Stern, thank you so much. I had a lot of fun today, and my inner child is satisfied. Yeah, those were
Daniel,
great
thank you
answers.
for introducing yourself and for inviting me to this interview. I also had a lot of fun. You're a great interviewer. If I could end with the little bit of German that I remember from school days, I will just end by saying this has simply been ausgezeichnet.
Ausgezeichnet, yeah, you're right.
Thank you.
I hope you have a great rest of the day, Alan.
Thank you, and you too, Daniel. I hope we meet someday in person.
That would be great.